I'll prove to you today that invisible choices decide your salary, your rent, and even your chance to prosper. And unfortunately, it's in the interest of many that you never realize this. Welcome to Telnomics, where we break down the economy to expose what truly drives your daily life. Before we move forward, think about this. If the economy grows year after year, why do so many people remain trapped in poverty? The International Monetary Fund projects that the global economy will expand by nearly 3% in 2025, despite trade and geopolitical tensions. Yet the World Bank warns that over 700 million people live in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2.15 per day. That's about 8.5% of the world's population. The paradox is evident. While trillions circulate in stock markets and multinational corporations fight over markets, millions remain without access to the basics. Why does this happen? Because economics, before being a graph or a formula, is about choices, deciding who gets access to limited resources in the face of infinite needs. Have you noticed that even the simple decision between buying a new phone or paying your electricity bill is, at its core, an economic dilemma? This tension between unlimited desires and scarce resources lies at the heart of all debate. And it's the same dilemma governments face when deciding between investing in healthcare, education, or infrastructure. But here comes the first provocation. If even the wealthiest nations cannot meet all the demands of their populations, who defines the priorities? Is it the financial elites, political leaders, or us, ordinary consumers, increasingly pushed around by the rules of the market? In the next part of our conversation, we will dive into this central conflict, where the question of who owns the means of production divides the world into two major visions: capitalism and communism. Are you ready to discover which one shapes your life more deeply? The property conflict. Capitalism versus communism. Think about this. If you own land, a building, or an industrial machine, even without working directly, you can get rich by renting or exploiting those assets. This is the essence of private ownership of the means of production. It allows some to live off rents while others, in order to survive, must rely on what doesn't belong to them. Here arises the great divide between two visions: capitalism, built on private property, and communism, based on collective ownership. Supporters of capitalism argue that individual motivation is the engine of progress. When someone works harder, studies more, or takes greater risks, they can earn raises, bonuses, or start a business. Just remember that in 2023, the United States recorded over 50 million active small businesses, responsible for more than 60% of new jobs in the country, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration. Competition also forces companies to innovate constantly. The clearest example is the technological leap of recent decades. In 2024, global investment in research and development surpassed $2.4 trillion, according to the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, fueling advances from mobile apps to medical treatments. But critics of capitalism emphasize that this same system produces structural inequality. According to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report of 2023, just 1% of the world's population controlled nearly 45% of all global wealth. This extreme concentration shows that while some accumulate billion-dollar fortunes, the majority struggles to cover basic expenses. Elon Musk is a clear example. In January 2025, Forbes estimated his fortune at about $230 billion, built on the labor of hundreds of thousands of employees at Tesla and SpaceX. For communists, that's not individual merit, but direct exploitation. And here lies the clash of visions. Capitalism promises efficiency, innovation, and prosperity, but tolerates brutal inequality. Communism, on the other hand, preaches social justice and collectivization, but is criticized for inefficiency and restrictions on individual freedom. So, which price would you be willing to pay? Inequality in exchange for innovation, or equality in exchange for possible limitations? As we reach the end of this section, here's the question. If private property is at the center of this conflict, is it also the root of the great social struggles throughout history? In the next part, we'll confront both systems in practice, exploring how markets and central planning attempt to answer the same questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. Market versus planning, the battle of decisions. The dilemma is simple yet brutal: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. In a capitalist market, prices and competition provide the answers. In central planning, the state decides. But which model truly performs better in times of crisis? Think back to the start of the pandemic in 2020. The surge in demand for masks caused prices to skyrocket. Within weeks, thousands of textile factories and even small sewing businesses shifted production lines. According to the World Health Organization, global demand for personal protective equipment was up to 100 times higher than the available productive capacity at that time. The market reacted quickly, but access remained unequal. Under central planning, the promise is different: coordination, rationality, and the absence of waste. In theory, if a government knows it needs 20,000 cars, it can plan exactly how many factories, workers, and tons of steel are required. That was how the Soviet Union managed to build the Dnieper Dam in just 5 years, completed in 1932, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of workers. But reality exposed its limits. Soviet internal reports, now public, reveal that up to 80% of industrial targets were distorted or delayed due to unreliable information. The challenge is this: markets can be fast, but also chaotic. Planning can be orderly, but often inefficient. The World Bank estimates that roughly 500 million tons of food are wasted each year globally, while hundreds of millions of people go hungry. In markets, food is left over but not distributed. Under central planning, food shortages arise because the calculations are wrong. And here comes the reflection. If both systems fail to fully address human needs, could the answer lie in combining market mechanisms with smarter state interventions? But if the state intervenes too much, doesn't that stifle innovation? And if everything is left completely free, doesn't that amplify crises? Let's now dive into the economic schools of thought that tried to solve this deadlock. From the classics, who saw the market as a natural order, to the Marxists, who saw exploitation as the key to the entire system. The inevitable question remains: who was closer to the truth? The economic schools, from promise to conflict. What if I told you that the greatest political and social disputes in history were born out of different ways of interpreting the economy? Since the 18th century, thinkers have tried to decode what truly generates wealth and how it should be distributed. The classics, led by Adam Smith, argued that the real source of prosperity lay in production and specialization. In The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith showed that dividing labor into simple steps could multiply productivity hundreds of times. The example of the pin factory, capable of increasing output from 10 to more than 40,000 units per day, became the symbol of that revolution. But soon a counterpoint emerged. Karl Marx, writing in the mid-19th century, saw exploitation where the classics saw efficiency. For him, the secret of profit lay in unpaid labor. The capitalist bought the workers' labor power for a wage that covered only survival, while the surplus became profit. Marx predicted that this system would inevitably lead to crises and revolutions, and indeed, the Russian Revolution of 1917 transformed these ideas into policy, reshaping the world map. In the 20th century, the Great Depression of 1929 challenged the belief that markets always self-regulate. British economist John Maynard Keynes brought forth a bold proposal. In times of crisis, the state should spend more, cut taxes, and stimulate jobs, even if it meant going into debt. This vision shaped the post-war Reconstruction, with the Marshall Plan injecting more than $13 billion into Western Europe between 1948 and 1952. The result? An economic boom that consolidated the West's leadership. But not everyone agreed. The Austrian school, with names like Friedrich Hayek, warned that excessive intervention paved the way for bureaucracy and authoritarianism. Meanwhile, the Chicago school, led by Milton Friedman, argued that controlling the supply of money was the key to preventing inflation and crises. Unsurprisingly, these ideas gained strength in the 1980s, with governments like Ronald Reagan's in the United States and Margaret Thatcher's in the United Kingdom. The conflict is clear. Should we trust the market as a natural order, or believe that only the state can prevent collapse? And what if both answers are incomplete? The weight of institutions and the price of inequality. Now, let's break the pattern. It's not just ideas that shape economies, but also the invisible rules that govern society. Institutions, laws, traditions, and customs determine whether a country prospers or stagnates. Economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson argue in Why Nations Fail 2012 that countries with inclusive institutions, which distribute power and protect property, tend to grow wealthier. Those with extractive institutions, concentrated in the hands of elites, remain poor. The most striking contrast is found on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, which invested in openness and education, reached a per capita GDP above $35,000 in 2024, according to the International Monetary Fund. Meanwhile, North Korea, under a closed regime, barely surpasses $1,500 per capita. How can two nations with such similar history and culture have such opposite destinies? In everyday life, this logic appears in simple situations. Imagine starting a business. If the law guarantees property, credit, and contracts, you invest. But if you must bribe authorities for every license, the cost skyrockets. The World Bank's Doing Business report of 2020 showed that opening a company in Singapore takes less than 2 days, while in some African countries it can take more than 100 days. This difference creates powerful incentives. Where rules are clear, businesses flourish. Where they are opaque, informality dominates. And here is the most unsettling point. Inequality is not only a side effect, but often an institutional project. The Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report of 2023 revealed that just 1% of the world's population controls nearly 45% of all global wealth. At the same time, more than 700 million people remain in extreme poverty. This imbalance erodes social trust and undermines political stability. History shows that deep institutional reforms take decades, but every small change, from a labor law to a fairer tax system, can create room for sustainable growth. The provocation is unavoidable. If we know institutions shape destiny, why do societies continue to tolerate rules that perpetuate stagnation and privilege? Next, let's explore how everyday life, from access to education to the cost of credit, is distorted by these institutional choices. The question remains, to what extent are you also a prisoner of your country's invisible rules, the invisible market that controls your life? What if I told you that, without realizing it, you too are a commodity? In capitalism, it's not only goods and services that have a price. Your time, your attention, and even your reputation are part of the game. Just look at the digital market. In 2024, the online advertising sector generated more than $550 billion, according to Statista, with companies competing for every second of your attention on a screen. What does this mean? That even your clicks are treated as tradable assets. But there is a growing silent conflict. The World Bank estimates that more than 500 million people worldwide lack access to formal employment, surviving through temporary or informal jobs. At the same time, global corporations seek cheaper labor in countries with weaker worker protections. The International Labor Organization reported in 2023 that around 250 million people are unemployed or underemployed. How can we expect motivation or productivity when millions feel like disposable parts? In daily life, this translates into familiar frustrations. How many times have you heard someone say they studied for years and still can't get a job that pays enough? Or the stories of young people accepting precarious jobs just to build experience. Modern economies turn diplomas into commodities, often devalued. According to UNESCO, in 2024, more than 200 million university students were enrolled worldwide, yet many struggle to transform education into real income. The reflection is inevitable. If everything becomes a commodity, from bread to the attention you give your phone, to what extent are we still in control of our own choices? And if the market defines value for every aspect of life, who decides what truly matters? Now, let's move toward the final answers. Is there a way out that balances growth, innovation, and social justice? Or are we condemned to repeat cycles of concentrated wealth and collective frustration? Get ready for the conclusion. Conclusion. Between the market and the future of society, we've reached the decisive point. After centuries of theory and practice, what have we learned? First, that no economic system is perfect. Capitalism has unleashed unprecedented innovation, but has also generated extreme inequality. Central planning promised social justice, but often delivered scarcity and bureaucracy. Yet the clearest evidence comes from the present. The International Monetary Fund projects global growth of about 3% in 2025, but warns that geopolitical tensions and the climate crisis could quickly erase those gains. In other words, stability is never guaranteed. Solutions exist, but they demand tough choices. The World Bank emphasizes that investments in education and basic infrastructure remain the most reliable drivers of poverty reduction and productivity. Nations that dedicate at least 5% of their GDP to education, such as South Korea, reap long-term results, today boasting a per capita GDP of more than $35,000. Meanwhile, countries that neglect these areas remain trapped in cycles of low growth and structural inequality. Another path is to strengthen inclusive institutions. As Acemoglu and Robinson demonstrate, societies that distribute power and protect property create incentives for innovation and prosperity. It's not about choosing more state or less state, but about designing institutions that reduce the predictable failures of both. Fiscal transparency, credible inflation targets, and independent justice systems are the foundations of trust. And trust is the invisible capital that drives every economy. The question that remains is this: will the future be a wild market where everything has a price, or a society capable of balancing innovation with social justice? The answer depends on political and personal choices made today. Here at Telnomics, our mission is to uncover these hidden gears so you can better understand your role in this process. If this content made you see things differently, subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe should change first, the market or the state? Thank you for staying with us until the end. This is just the beginning of many conversations we'll continue to have about the future of the economy and the world.